All right, so today we're diving into one of those cases that just, captures the imagination, the Patty Hearst trial.
Oh, absolutely.
Now we've got court documents, trial transcripts, even some firsthand accounts. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to really unpack all this.
And that's what we're going to do. Not just sort of like give the basic facts, but really like try and understand why this story, continues to grab people's attention even decades later. Because, you have this heiress turned revolutionary,
Right.
this radical group.
Yeah.
The whole thing is just kind of like, what is the psychology of it all?
Right.
How much did the media play a role?
Exactly.
And the big question, was she a victim or was she a perpetrator?
It's a question that still resonates today, doesn't it?
It really does.
And I think what's fascinating is that this case goes beyond just the crime itself.
Okay.
It really offers us a glimpse into American society at a pivotal moment.
Okay.
We're talking about the 1970s. Vietnam War is raging.
Yeah.
There's this deep distrust of the government.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And groups like the Symbionese Liberation Army, the SLA, they're emerging and gaining traction.
Right. The SLA, they're the ones who kidnapped Patty Hearst.
Yeah, exactly.
What was their deal anyway? Like, weren't they trying to, overthrow the government?
Well, they had a pretty radical agenda, for sure. They wanted to dismantle capitalism, abolish prisons, even get rid of traditional family structures.
Wow.
They saw themselves as revolutionaries fighting against a system they perceived as totally corrupt.
Right, right.
And Patty Hearst, the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, this media tycoon, she was the ultimate symbol of the elite they were targeting.
Right. So they kidnap her from her Berkeley apartment. And suddenly this young woman from this incredibly wealthy family
Yeah.
is thrust into this world of, radical ideology and violence.
It's February 4th, 1974.
Wow.
Can you imagine the terror?
Oh, my God.
She's blindfolded, held captive, subjected to psychological manipulation, just abuse. It's awful.
It's hard to even fathom.
It is, and the SLA's goal was to break her down. Yeah. To mold her into this weapon for their cause.
This is where I think things get really interesting, and I know it's controversial, but
Yeah.
the whole idea of Stockholm Syndrome,
Right.
is that what we're seeing here?
Potentially.
Did she develop empathy for her captors
Hmm.
as a way to cope with this trauma?
It's a very complex question, and there's a lot of debate around Stockholm Syndrome in general. Some psychologists argue that it is a very real response to extreme stress.
Right.
When you are completely dependent on your captors for survival,
Right.
it's possible for your brain to start rationalizing their actions, even developing positive feelings towards them.
As a way to, protect yourself.
Exactly, as a way to reduce this cognitive dissonance.
Okay, so that's one side of it. But there are some people who say that this whole Stockholm Syndrome thing is just a way to kind of excuse criminal behavior, right?
Yeah, there are definitely critics who argue that it's really difficult to prove that such a syndrome actually exists, and that it often overlooks the very real power dynamics at play in hostage situations.
Yeah.
They argue that focusing on Stockholm Syndrome can actually distract from holding perpetrators accountable for their actions.
Okay, so where does that leave us with Patty Hearst? Was it Stockholm Syndrome or was it something else entirely?
Well, things take a really dramatic turn about 2 months after the kidnapping.
Yep.
April 15th, 1974, Patty Hearst is caught on security camera footage,
Uh-oh.
participating in a bank robbery with members of the SLA.
Wait, what? I remember seeing that footage.
Right.
It's her holding a rifle, and she's looking... I don't even know how to describe it. It was shocking.
Absolutely. It was a complete shock to the nation.
Yeah.
Here you have this young woman who was seen as a helpless victim just weeks earlier.
Right.
And now she's seemingly embracing the very ideology of her captors.
Yeah.
And the big question everyone was asking is she being forced to do this, or is this a willing choice?
It's impossible to tell from the footage.
Exactly. And that's where the media frenzy kicks in.
Right.
Newspapers, TV stations, they become obsessed with this story
Oh, yeah.
and often present it in this very sensationalized way.
Right.
Headlines screaming about the Tanya persona she had adopted.
Right. The name the SLA gave her.
Exactly. It was everywhere. You couldn't escape it.
It was just consuming the news cycle.
It really was dominating every conversation.
That image of her in the bank robbery just became the defining image of the case. But it also raised this huge question, right? Was she a victim of coercion, or had she really bought into the SLA's ideology?
Yeah, that question really was at the heart of the trial.
Okay, so the trial starts in 1976.
February 4th, 1976, to be exact.
2 years to the day after the kidnapping.
Wow. Exactly. Can you imagine the media frenzy surrounding this?
Oh my gosh, I bet it was insane.
It was a circus, and here's Patty, who had been through this horrific ordeal. Now she's the one on trial facing these serious charges.
It's crazy how the victim becomes the accused.
Yeah, it's a really interesting twist.
So what was the defense's strategy? I mean, how did they try to explain her actions?
Well, her lawyer was F. Lee Bailey.
Oh, wow. F. Lee Bailey. That's a big name.
Huge name, and he went with a very controversial defense.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
He argued that Patty had been brainwashed by the SLA.
Brainwashed?
Yes. He claimed that the weeks of intense psychological manipulation, the threats, the isolation, it all broken her down.
Wow.
And forced her to essentially adopt their ideology just as a means of survival.
So he was saying she wasn't acting out of her own free will.
Exactly. That she was a victim of coercion.
Okay, but how do you prove something like brainwashing in a court of law?
Right. That was the huge challenge for the defense.
Yeah.
There was no legal precedent for a brainwashing defense.
Right.
And the prosecution argued that Patty's actions after the robbery, they suggested that she was acting freely.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they pointed to the communiques.
Oh, what?
The communiques, those recorded messages released by the SLA,
Oh, right.
where Patty denounced her family and expressed support for the SLA's cause.
Wait. So she was making public statements in support of the SLA.
She was, and the prosecution argued that these communiques, along with instances where she seemingly had opportunities to escape, but didn't prove that she had become a true believer.
Okay, so you've got this footage of her with a rifle at the bank robbery.
Right.
And then you've got these communiques where she's denouncing her family.
Mm-hmm.
It does make you wonder.
It does, and the jury had this incredibly difficult task.
Yeah.
Trying to determine, was she a victim of coercion or a cunning manipulator?
Right, playing the system.
Exactly. And you can't underestimate the impact of the media coverage either.
Oh, for sure.
That constant barrage of news, reports, the dramatic headlines, the way they portrayed her, it all influenced public opinion.
And probably had an impact on the jury, too.
Almost certainly, and it's just hard to imagine having your life dissected so publicly like that.
Yeah, especially after going through such a traumatic experience.
Absolutely, and during the trial, the prosecution brought in a psychiatrist, Dr. Joel Fort, and he had a significant impact on the jury's thinking.
What did he say?
Well, Ford argued that Patty was predisposed to radicalism even before her kidnapping.
Really?
Yeah. He pointed to incidents from her past that he interpreted as signs of rebellion and a disregard for authority.
So he was basically saying that she was already on this path to extremism even before the SLA came along.
Yeah, exactly. And he downplayed the idea of brainwashing, saying that other SLA members had joined the group voluntarily.
Without being coerced.
Right. He was essentially trying to dismantle the defense's entire narrative.
That's fascinating. Did Patty testify herself?
She did. She took the stand to describe the alleged brainwashing and the abuse she suffered, but her testimony was met with a lot of skepticism.
Why is that?
Well, some of her claims seemed inconsistent with the evidence. For example, she described being raped by one of her captors, but was later found to have kept a gift from him.
Oh, wow.
This discrepancy cast doubt on her claims of being completely controlled by the SLA, and then there was the fact that she repeatedly pleaded the Fifth Amendment during cross-examination.
Which made it seem like she was hiding something.
Exactly. So the jury was left with a lot of unanswered questions.
Okay, so after all of that, after hearing all this conflicting testimony, what happened?
Well, the jury deliberated for 12 hours.
Wow.
Many of them ending their session in tears.
Really?
Yeah, it was a very emotionally charged case. And on March 20th, 1976, they reached a verdict. Patty Hearst was found guilty of armed robbery and using a firearm to commit a felony.
Wow, a guilty verdict. What was the reaction like?
It was huge news, of course, and people were very divided.
I can imagine.
Some people believed that she had manipulated the system,
Right.
while others felt a lot of sympathy for her.
Yeah, it's such a complicated case.
It is. So what happened to her after the trial? Did she serve her full sentence?
Yeah, what happened?
Well, she was sentenced to 7 years in prison, but her sentence was later commuted by President Jimmy Carter after she served just 22 months.
Oh, wow.
And then in a final twist, President Bill Clinton granted her a full pardon on his last day in office in 2001.
A full pardon. That's incredible.
It is, and it just goes to show that even after the trial, even after the verdict, the debate about her guilt or innocence, her role in all of this continued.
Yeah, it's like nobody could really agree on what to make of Patty Hearst.
Exactly, and that's what makes this case so fascinating. It forces us to confront these really complex issues.
Like what?
like individual agency versus societal pressure, the power of ideology, the difficulty of separating truth from manipulation.
You know, it's a case that really makes you think, even with all the evidence, the
Yeah.
trial, the verdict, even the pardon,
Right.
we're still left wondering what was truly going on in Patty Hearst's mind.
It's the enduring mystery of this case, isn't it? Was she a victim manipulated and brainwashed by this dangerous group, or did she actually become a true believer in their ideology?
Right.
Willingly embracing this life of crime, or maybe it was somewhere in between,
Yeah.
this complex mix of coercion and choice.
And then you throw in that pardon from President Clinton.
Right.
It adds a whole other layer to the story.
It does.
What does that say about how our justice system views cases like this?
Yeah.
Where the lines between victim and perpetrator are so blurry.
It really highlights the challenges of trying to apply these legal definitions to situations that are just so deeply human
Yeah.
and often defy simple categorization, you know?
Right.
Patty Hearst's case forced the courts to grapple with the complexities of trauma manipulation ideology.
It wasn't an easy case.
It wasn't a straightforward case of right and wrong, and that's what makes it so compelling even all these years later.
It's a reminder that sometimes, even with all the evidence in the world, truth can remain elusive.
Especially when you're dealing with something as powerful and unpredictable as the human mind.
Right.
I mean, the Patty Hearst trial wasn't just about one woman.
Right.
It was a reflection of this really turbulent era in American history.
Yeah, the 70s.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A time of social and political upheaval where these radical ideas were circulating, and it felt like the very fabric of society was unraveling.
Yeah, and it feels like those same questions about truth manipulation, the power of ideology, are just as relevant today.
Oh, absolutely.
Maybe even more so.
I think so. We're bombarded with information from all sides, social media, the news.
It's overwhelming.
It can be, and it makes it really hard to know what to believe.
So true.
The Patty Hearst case, I think, serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder to be critical thinkers, to question everything,
Right.
and to really seek out multiple perspectives before we form our own opinions.
It's so important to not just accept things at face value.
Exactly.
So what does all of this mean for us today?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is, for me, the Patty Hearst case is just a reminder to stay curious, to never stop questioning,
Yeah.
and to really try to understand the complexities of human experience, even when it seems impossible.
I think that's a great takeaway. You know, we may never know the full truth of what happened to Patty Hearst, but the questions her case raises about individual agency, the power of belief, the search for justice, those questions continue to resonate so deeply.
They do.
And those are questions worth pondering long after this deep dive is over.
This case has certainly given us a lot to think about.
It has.
It's both fascinating and disturbing.
Yeah.
A true reminder that sometimes the most compelling mysteries are those that remain unsolved.
I agree.